During the 1990s, a tight-knit community of Indian immigrants living in New York found themselves living in terror, not from strangers, but from one of their own. When victims sought protection from law enforcement, they were met with threats and violence. Yet two courageous men refused to be silenced. Their willingness to speak out had the potential to stop the bloodshed, but only if federal investigators could build a case against a man whose criminal empire ran deep. For many who left India behind, America represented a second chance, a place where hard work could build a future their homeland couldn't offer. One man, however, saw that dream not as an opportunity to build something honest, but as cover for something sinister. As bodies began appearing within New York's Indian immigrant community, detectives struggled to connect a web of violence and financial crime to a single, untouchable figure: Jim Kallstrom, former head, FBI New York office. When the promise of America was turned into something dark, corrupted by greed and murder, the FBI stepped in to restore some sense of hope to families whose worlds had been torn apart. On July 9, 1995, a young man named Kulwan Singh made his way to a Bronx gas station for a late-night shift. He had come to the United States less than a year before, leaving behind a modest town in India with hopes of creating a better future for himself and the family he left behind. He never came home that night. He simply vanished. Months passed without a word. By October, his brother Manmohan had grown desperate enough to board a plane and cross the ocean to find him. Silence from Kulwan was out of character. He was the kind of man who stayed in touch. Manmohan started his search in Queens, tracking down one of his brother's acquaintances, a man named Satinder Jit Singh. Though they shared the same surname, the two were not related. In the Sikh faith, many men carry the name Singh, a Punjabi word meaning lion, as a mark of their religious identity. Satinder confirmed that a missing persons report had been filed, but that police had turned up nothing. He urged Manmohan to tread carefully. Looking for his brother, he warned, could put him in serious danger. Manmohan pressed on anyway, visiting the Bronx gas station where his brother had last worked. He found an attendant willing to listen, but too frightened to speak openly. A supervisor hovered nearby, making it clear that questions weren't welcome. Determined, Manmohan persuaded the attendant to meet him privately at a local diner days later. Attendant: "I don't have much time. I know why you're here." The attendant revealed that Kulwan had been accused of pocketing money from the station's register. Whether or not there was any truth to it, the accusation had enraged the station's owner. The attendant feared the worst, that Kulwan had been taken against his will and likely killed. A year and a half passed. By March 1997, Manmohan had taken a night job at another New York gas station, using his days to quietly dig for answers. He was becoming increasingly certain he knew who was behind his brother's disappearance, and he was preparing to take that information to the police. Then, on the night of March 16, 1997, he was shot dead before he ever got the chance. Brooklyn's North Homicide Unit responded to a call from a customer who discovered the body. Detectives documented the scene and collected 2 spent casings from a 9mm Ruger. The register had been emptied, but oddly, not all of the cash was taken. There were no fingerprints anywhere. Detective Tony Brazada. At first glance, it looked like a standard gas station robbery. But the more we looked at it, the more it felt deliberate. The victim had been shot at extremely close range from behind while on his knees. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This was an execution. Detectives made their way to the Sikh temple hosting the victim's funeral. They understood the community's deep reluctance to involve outsiders, particularly law enforcement, but hoped someone would be willing to help. One man stepped forward, Satjit Singh. He told detectives he had known the deceased personally, and when they explained that silence would almost certainly let the killer walk free, he made a decision that would change everything. Despite knowing it could cost him his life, he agreed to cooperate. The next day, Satjit arrived at the precinct as promised. He brought along a second witness, a man named Sarjeet, who was equally prepared to speak. Together, they pointed detectives toward a name: Dinsa. A wealthy and influential figure within the Sikh community, Dinsa had allegedly ordered both the murder of their friend and the earlier abduction of the victim's brother. Dinsa's story was, on the surface, a classic immigrant success story. He had arrived from India in the mid-1980s with virtually nothing and had built a business empire of more than 50 gas stations across the New York metropolitan area. But beneath that success was something far darker. Detective Teddy Braun. Everything Dinsa built was built on fear. He had that entire community walking on eggshells. People were so terrified of him that he could commit a crime in plain view of a crowd and not one person would breathe a word about it. A review of Dinsa's history with law enforcement told its own story. Prior convictions for violent assault, kidnapping, robbery, fuel pump fraud, and illegal weapons. He had done time on multiple occasions, yet always managed to resurface and rebuild his operation. Those within the community had a name for him: the Indian Godfather. His operation was kept firmly within the family. His brother served as both a trusted member of the inner circle and the organization's primary enforcer. Sarjeet had witnessed the brother's capacity for violence firsthand. In 1993, outside a restaurant in Queens, he watched as Dinsa's brother got into an altercation with another man and ended it by shooting him at close range. Sarjeet ran to the victim, but there was nothing to be done. The brother was quickly smuggled out of the country to India and was never brought to justice. Now, the two witnesses were hearing rumors that the brother was planning to return to the United States. Speaking to police was an enormous risk, but they could no longer stand by while the violence continued. They promised to alert detectives the moment he arrived. Witness: he's coming back because the business had grown too large for Dinsa to manage alone. And Dinsa always preferred family over outsiders when it came to handling his money. The witnesses kept their word. In May 1997, they notified police that Dinsa's brother had returned to New York. Detectives set up a perimeter around Dinsa's Brooklyn warehouse, his operational base, and waited. Both witnesses were on hand to assist with identification. Armed with a valid arrest warrant, officers sealed every exit. From an unmarked surveillance vehicle, Sarjeet confirmed the target's identity as he approached the front entrance. Moments later, radio reports crackled through gunshots had been fired inside the building. Officers held their positions until the order came to move in. They breached the front of the building. 3 men bolted out the rear, straight into officers waiting outside. The 3 were Dinsa's brother, his cousin, and his nephew. All were taken into custody. With a search warrant quickly obtained, officers recovered an arsenal, 7 handguns, a shotgun, and a silenced automatic weapon. As the weapons were being loaded into a patrol vehicle, Dinsa himself pulled up to the scene. He insisted the building and everything inside it belonged to him. The problem? The weapons were all illegal. He was arrested on the spot for unlawful firearms possession. At the 112th precinct, Dinsa was booked, printed, and questioned. Investigators reminded him that 2 witnesses were prepared to testify against him and his brother in a murder case. He denied everything and refused to say another word. Held at Brooklyn Correctional Facility while awaiting a bail hearing, Dinsa nonetheless found ways to maintain control of his operation from behind bars. Conducting conversations in Punjabi, a language the guards didn't understand, he quietly worked to identify who had spoken to the police and made clear what would happen to them if they continued. Without more than witness testimony, investigators knew their case was fragile. Dinsa would make bail soon, and once free, those witnesses might not live long enough to testify. In May 1997, 2 brothers with roots in the Indian immigrant community had been arrested on charges connected to years of violence and intimidation. Apart from the accounts of 2 witnesses, law enforcement had little concrete evidence. Their core belief that Dinsa had personally directed 2 murders and a kidnapping remained difficult to prove in court. Dinsa was released on bail on May 4, 1997. His brother remained locked up at Rikers Island on a murder charge. Through contacts on the outside, Dinsa had already pieced together the identities of the men willing to testify against him. Their continued cooperation threatened everything he had built. One of those witnesses, Satjit Singh, had spent years working alongside Dinsa's employees and had an intimate understanding of how the gas station network actually operated. He described a system of rigged fuel pumps, skimmed profits, and targeted violence against anyone who raised objections. Investigators believed his account was detailed enough to pursue formal charges. In early June 1997, they sat down with federal prosecutors to map out the extent of Dinsa's illegal activity. Detective Teddy Braun. He controlled over 50 gas stations and had engineered a sophisticated fuel skimming operation. The system was designed to shortchange customers. If someone paid for $10 worth of fuel, the pump could be calibrated to deliver only 80 or 90% of what they paid for. The rest went straight into Dinsa's pocket. St. U.S. Attorney Ben Campbell. Federal authorities were briefed on an organization that was systematically defrauding customers at gas stations across New York and New Jersey, generating millions in illegal income and using murder and intimidation to keep that operation protected. On June 18th, just as the federal case was taking shape, Satjit Singh was shot and killed on a street in Queens. The timing was not coincidental. The murder took place the day before a scheduled court appearance by Dinsa's brother. A neighbor who happened to be outside that evening witnessed the shooting. He had been on his front stoop watching a baseball game. His apartment had no air conditioning. What initially looked like a road dispute escalated into violence in seconds. He described the shooter as a tall black man, but was unable to see his face clearly. Satjit's cousin, who had been in the car beside him, was too shaken to provide a useful description. Everything had happened in moments. Crime scene technicians processed the area and recovered shell casings from a 9mm firearm. Beyond that, there was nothing. No forensic link, no physical evidence connecting Dinsa to the killing. Investigators knew that if Dinsa was allowed to continue operating freely, more people would die. Something had to change. NYPD detectives consulted with federal prosecutors about a different approach, one that would bring the full weight of federal law to bear. The answer was the RICO statute, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, the same legal framework used to dismantle traditional organized crime syndicates. ASST. U.S. Attorney Ben Campbell. The case had all the characteristics of a classic racketeering prosecution, a structured organization with identifiable leadership, income generated through criminal activity, and a sustained pattern of violence stretching back nearly 10 years. Bringing the FBI into the investigation significantly expanded its scope. Special Agent in charge Kevin Donovan of the FBI's New York field office took the lead. Special Agent Kevin Donovan. Our approach was consistent with how we handle organized crime, building cooperative witnesses, executing search warrants, reviewing financial records, and targeting both the violent crimes and the underlying fraud simultaneously. None of it would be straightforward. Building a witness base required first guaranteeing the safety of those willing to speak. And as long as Dinsa could reach people through fear and violence, that safety was impossible to guarantee. Special Agent Kevin Donovan. Every act of violence Dinsa committed or ordered made it harder for us to find people willing to talk. We had to stop the bleeding before we could build the case. Word of Satjit's murder spread rapidly through the Sikh community. The second witness, Sarjeet, immediately began making plans to leave New York with his wife and young children. Investigators urged him to accept FBI protective custody, but he refused. He wanted his family out of the city. Dinsa had succeeded in silencing yet another potential witness. To those living within the community, the message was clear. Not even federal law enforcement could protect them. As summer 1997 arrived, the FBI's target remained elusive. Investigators were now confident that Dinsa had been responsible for 2 killings, 1 kidnapping, and the forced exile of a key witness. What they lacked was someone on the inside, someone close enough to Dinsa to provide evidence that could hold up in court. Special Agent Kevin Donovan. The biggest obstacle we faced early on was the language barrier and the culture of fear that Dinsa had created. The people closest to his operation were terrified of him. His track record of violence was well established, and nobody wanted to be next. Dinsa then turned his attention to another member of the community, a man named Balwan Singh, a close friend of the witness who had already fled the city. Balwan had been visited by one of Dinsa's associates at the funeral of the slain witness. The man's message was direct. Dinsa wanted to know where the remaining witness was hiding and wanted a face-to-face conversation with him about what he planned to tell investigators. Balwan said nothing and gave nothing away, but the encounter left him shaken. He locked himself in his apartment with his wife and daughter for 3 days before finally calling police. When he reached the Queen's Homicide Unit handling the Satjit Singh murder, officers immediately recognized the significance of his account. They promised to discuss protective arrangements and dispatched detectives to meet him directly. Balwan Singh. If I don't come forward now, I'm going to be the next one. In the meantime, Balwan was called away on a work errand for his construction business. He promised his frightened family he'd be back quickly. He was well aware of how dangerous his situation had become. Minutes into his drive, he spotted a vehicle trailing him. Behind the wheel was Dinsa himself. Balwan turned around immediately and headed home. Dinsa drove off. When detectives en route to Balwan's apartment received an urgent message from their supervisor, they stopped to use a payphone. While on the call, one detective noticed an Indian man in a nearby car watching him intently. They approached, asked for identification, and found themselves face to face with Dinsa. He consented to a search of his vehicle. Inside, fuel receipts. In the trunk, electronic gauges used for calibrating gas pumps. Nothing illegal. With no active warrant, they had no choice but to let him go. They never made it to Balwan that day. The following morning, Balwan's wife contacted police. Her husband was sheltering at a friend's gas station, too afraid to go home. Detectives picked him up, then collected his wife and daughter. That evening, the family was relocated to an undisclosed location outside the city under police protection, where they would stay until Dinsa could be permanently removed from the streets. When shown a photograph for identification purposes, Balwan's response was immediate. Balwan Singh. That's him. No question about it. Investigators now had a third witness, but they still didn't have enough to make an arrest stick. By July 1997, the FBI and NYPD jointly believed they had identified the man responsible for 2 murders, 1 kidnapping, and a sustained campaign of witness intimidation. Their conviction was strong. Their evidence was not. At the end of July, Detective Teddy Braun sat down with a confidential source who had direct knowledge of Dinsa's inner workings. Detective Teddy Braun. During that interview, my partner came across a man called Marvin, described as someone Dinsa used to handle things that required a more physical approach. The full name was Marvin Dodson, a 35-year-old with a prior record involving illegal weapons. When Satjit's cousin, who had been in the car during the murder, was shown a photo lineup, he pointed to Dodson without hesitation. Detective Anthony Brazada began tracking Dodson down. On July 4, 1997, officers located him in Queens and took him into custody. Faced with serious charges, Dodson agreed to cooperate in exchange for a reduced sentence. On July 6th, Dodson met with detectives, federal prosecutors, and FBI agents, his attorney present throughout. He admitted to being hired by Dinsa to carry out the murder of Satjit Singh. According to Dodson, the operation was set in motion on May 18, 1997, the same day Dinsa was released on bail. The target was the witness scheduled to testify against Dinsa's brother. Dodson was recruited as the shooter. The weapon of choice, a 9mm Ruger, matching the caliber of the casings collected at the crime scene. Dinsa then instructed Dodson to bring in a driver. He personally provided surveillance on the witness, everything Dodson would need to locate and eliminate him. ASST U.S. Attorney Ben Campbell. Dinsa supplied the home address, the vehicle description, and the license plate number. He told Dodson to monitor the target and act at the first available opportunity. On the morning of June 18, 1997, Dodson received the call. The witness had to be dead before evening. Dinsa's brother's court date was the following morning. The message to anyone else considering cooperation would be unmistakable. Dodson and his associate, a man named Walter Jazz Samuels, met Dinsa at one of his gas stations. A white van was provided. They staked out Satjit's home until he emerged with his cousin. Using a deliberate traffic confrontation to force Satjit to stop, the van then moved to block any escape. Dodson fired 8 rounds at close range into the unarmed man. Afterward, the van was returned to Dinsa's Roosevelt Avenue garage. The weapon was handed back to Dinsa, who paid Dodson and Samuels a combined $20,000 for the killing. On July 6th, officers arrested Samuels at his Brooklyn home. With both men in custody, investigators refocused on Dinsa himself. Federal prosecutors determined they had sufficient grounds for a RICO indictment. Special Agent Kevin Donovan. Surveillance teams were deployed across multiple City Gas Corporation locations anywhere Dinsa was known to spend time. At 5:00 p.m. on July 7, 1997, agents tracked Dinsa to his Foster Avenue station. Officers moved in and placed him under arrest on charges of murder, kidnapping, fuel pump fraud, and obstruction of justice within a corrupt enterprise. The prosecution's case, however, rested almost entirely on the word of a confessed killer. The U.S. attorney needed supporting evidence. That's where Samuels came in. Except Samuels now claimed he hadn't been in the van at all on the day of the murder. He said he'd been at a nearby restaurant at the time, and his alibi held up. Investigators believed Samuels knew who had actually been behind the wheel. But he wasn't giving that information up. Neither was Dodson. A search of Dinsa's Roosevelt Avenue garage turned up little beyond stolen license plates. Nothing that could independently connect Dinsa to the murder. Dinsa went back behind bars pending a bail hearing on July 14th. Once again, investigators hoped his detention would loosen tongues within the community. Once again, it didn't. Special Agent Kevin Donovan. Even from a prison phone, Dinsa continued to run his business and to make clear to potential witnesses what would happen if they spoke to us. For the second time in 3 months, the suspected kingpin was locked up. This time, investigators were determined it would be permanent. But Dinsa had assembled an expensive legal team, and the case against him was still far from airtight. This time, while Dinsa worked the phones from his jail cell, still believing his Punjabi conversations were private, investigators were recording every word. Asked U.S. Attorney Ben Campbell. Finding a qualified Punjabi translator took time. And even once we had one, Dinsa was rarely direct. He communicated in a layered, coded way that made interpretation difficult. But once we broke through that, we had an extraordinary window into how he operated. The recordings revealed a man fully in command of his empire even from behind bars. Dinsa called his stations regularly, adjusting fuel prices, ordering supplies, coordinating with employees, all while simultaneously issuing instructions to his lawyers about securing his release. The key to his fraud was simple and effective. Advertise the lowest fuel prices in the area to draw in customers, then systematically underdeliver on every transaction. Meanwhile, officers processing Dinsa's vehicle made a significant discovery. Inside, they found business cards directly linking him to both Dodson and Samuels. They also recovered what appeared to be a written list of names and home addresses, a potential hit list. On it, the address of Sarjeet Singh, the witness who had escaped the city with his family. Also listed, Balwan Singh, currently under protective custody. 7 additional Punjabi names completed the list. It was exactly what prosecutors needed to oppose bail. Agents confronted Samuels with the list. The sight of it broke his silence. He confirmed that all 9 individuals on the list had been targeted for elimination by Dinsa. 2 were federal witnesses. The remaining 7 were members of Balwan's family, all still alive. In an adjacent room, Dodson corroborated every detail and went further. He revealed that just days before his most recent arrest, Dinsa had acquired 2 decommissioned police cruisers. The plan was for Dodson and Samuels to impersonate officers, intercept Balwan Singh and his family on the street, and transport them to a location of Dinsa's choosing. ASST U.S. Attorney Ben Campbell. The scheme was to use the appearance of law enforcement authority to abduct an entire family. They would be taken somewhere undisclosed and handed directly to Dinsa. Hoping to reduce his own exposure, Samuels finally gave up the name of the man who had actually driven the van during the murder, Evans Alonzo Powell. Dodson had gone out of his way to shield Powell, who had no criminal record, even threatening Samuels to keep him quiet. On July 19, 1997, Powell was arrested on a Brooklyn street. He chose to cooperate. He confirmed that he had been behind the wheel during the killing in Queens. Investigators finally had their corroborating witness. Powell also provided information about the earlier murder, the killing of Manmohan Singh at the Brooklyn gas station on March 16, 1997. Powell had been present that night as well. Detective Tony Brazada. Dodson admitted to shooting the victim twice in the back of the head while he was on his knees. He said Dinsa had paid him to do it. No explanation was given. Dinsa simply wanted the man dead. For that killing, Dinsa had paid Dodson just $4,000. Investigators now turned their attention to the physical evidence of Dinsa's fraud operation. A search warrant was executed at the Foster Avenue station. Special Agent Kevin Donovan. The search focused specifically on the pump rigging mechanism. After excavating the area around the fuel pumps, agents uncovered electronic control devices buried in a concealed compartment, the hardware at the center of the entire skimming operation. The system was controlled wirelessly. Devices buried beneath the pumps could be activated or deactivated using a remote nearly identical to a standard car key fob. Employees were trained to switch the system off when a customer brought in a portable container, such as a fuel can, to avoid any obvious discrepancy in the amount delivered. Detective Teddy Braun. The way it worked was simple. If someone walked in with a gas can, the attendant would hit the remote in his pocket. That turned the skimmer off and the pump ran at full accuracy. The customer got exactly what they paid for. No suspicion. But for everyone filling up at the pump, car after car all day long, they were getting shortchanged every single time. A subsequent search of Dinsa's Brooklyn warehouse headquarters uncovered financial records, including a separate set of books detailing bribe payments made to a corrupt city inspector. Special Agent Kevin Donovan. Documentation recovered at the warehouse indicated systematic payments to a Department of Consumer Affairs official. Our analysis suggested that over a 10-year period, the pump fraud operation had generated approximately $40 million in stolen revenue. One piece of the puzzle remained unresolved. By September 1998, the body of Kulwan Singh, abducted from a Bronx gas station 3 years earlier, had never been recovered. Investigators developed a theory based on construction timelines. Records showed that one of Dinsa's stations, located at the intersection of Farragut and Flatbush Avenue, had been undergoing significant work around the time of the disappearance. On September 16, 1998, a crew arrived with excavation equipment and ground-penetrating radar. 2 locations beneath the station were identified as sites of interest. Concrete slabs were removed and the earth beneath carefully examined. No remains were found. It was a setback. But the broader case was moving forward. Subpoenaed cell phone records placed Dinsa in the immediate vicinity of Satjit Singh's murder at the time it occurred. Prosecutors entered the courtroom well prepared. The trial opened at Brooklyn Federal District Court. The government sought conviction on 29 separate counts, including capital murder. Sarjit Singh, who had remained engaged with the investigation in spite of credible threats against his life, took the stand against the man accused of ending his friends' lives. On March 2, 1999, after roughly 2.5 days of jury deliberation, Dinsa was found guilty on 21 of the 29 counts, including murder, attempted murder, and fraud. He was acquitted on the kidnapping charge related to the victim whose body was never recovered. On October 5, 1999, the judge handed down 8 consecutive life sentences, with no possibility of parole. Dinsa would not face execution, but he would never walk free. Later that same month, his accomplices were sentenced. In recognition of their cooperation, their terms were significantly reduced. Powell received 10 years, Samuels 12, and Dodson 18. ASST U.S. Attorney Ben Campbell. On a personal level, this case meant a great deal to me. We were able to walk into a community that rarely feels comfortable turning to law enforcement and actually make a difference. We removed someone who had been preying on that community for years. There's really no better way to describe what he was than a plague. And now that plague was gone. Dinsa had arrived in America the same way countless others had, with little money and a community ready to welcome him. He was given the same chances, the same support, the same opportunity to build something real. Instead, he chose exploitation and murder. For that choice, he will spend the rest of his life behind bars, never to be free again.